Welcome to the History Maps podcast. In the 1970s, a British mathematician named Roger Penrose formally described a highly complex system of geometry.
Right. He figured out a way to cover a two-dimensional surface with a pattern that never actually repeats itself.
Exactly. It's a concept known as quasi-crystalline symmetry. And for decades, this was considered a modern mathematical triumph, right?
Yeah, it was a massive breakthrough that eventually contributed to a Nobel Prize in physics.
But if you were to travel to a 15th century shrine in Iran or, a mosque in Central Asia, and you look closely at the complex interlocking tile patterns on the walls, you would find those exact same infinite, non-repeating Penrose geometries.
It's really intense to think about.
Yeah.
Because the medieval artisans who built those structures were executing principles of advanced quantum geometry centuries before Western mathematics had the language to even articulate what a quasi-crystal was.
Right. And they were doing this not with chalkboards or equations.
No, absolutely not. They were working with chisels, raw clay, metallic oxides, and just a really profound understanding of spatial logic.
This is a deep dive into the history of Islamic tiles, which is part of our broader Islamic history series. And our mission for you, the listener, is to explore how a synthesis of regional craftsmanship, extremely advanced chemistry, and strict theological principles transform the most basic material.
Right, literal dirt.
Exactly, dirt, into architectural masterpieces across the Islamic world. We're going on a journey that spans from the early glazed bricks of the Uyghurs to the mind-bending tessellations of the 15th century and beyond.
And to do that, it requires us to completely reframe how we view a building because when we look at standard architecture today, the materials are brutally honest.
Like steel acts as steel, bearing weight.
Right. And glass acts as glass, letting in light. But the architectural traditions of the Islamic world took standard clay and sand and fundamentally disguised their physical nature.
They manipulated these materials until solid walls appeared like woven textiles.
Exactly, and heavy masonry domes reflected the infinite complexity of the cosmos.
But before we can understand how they manipulated those materials into complex geometry, we really have to look at the raw materials themselves. Because, you cannot build a 5-story, non-repeating tessellation if your fundamental building block is flawed.
Right. We have to begin with the foundation. We need to look closely at the transition from standard glazed bricks to the invention of this composite material called stone paste.
So if we go back to the earliest forms of architectural tile work in the region, what were they using?
Well, the artisans were working directly with standard structural bricks. The Uyghurs and later the Anatolian Seljuks established a practice where they would take a standard baked clay brick and apply a vitreous glaze to just one of the narrow exposed sides.
Wait, so these were not small decorative bathroom tiles?
No, these were heavy, load-bearing bricks. They were structural elements that also served a decorative function. And the artisans favored bold, highly visible colors. We're talking vibrant turquoises, deep cobalt purples, and rich, reddish tones. So when they constructed a wall or a tower, they would alternate these glazed bricks with standard unglazed red bricks.
So if I'm standing in front of a Seljuk building from the 13th century, how are these bricks actually arranged? Are they just scattered for a pop of color?
Not at all. They were arranged in massive, sweeping geometric patterns, and sometimes the glazed bricks were laid out to form monumental Kufic script.
That's the angular early form of Arabic calligraphy, right?
Exactly, yes. And they would build that script directly into the masonry of the building's facade. You can see a prominent example of this at the Yivli Minaret in the city of Antalya, which dates to the late 13th century, or on the facade of the Sahabi Madrasa.
Right. The minaret in Antalya is this massive fluted tower, and the turquoise bricks follow the vertical channels of the structure. The sunlight hits the glaze and creates this vivid contrast against the matte red clay.
It's a striking visual.
But using whole bricks has its limits, especially if you want to create something delicate or highly detailed.
Yeah, standard clay presents several severe limitations for an artisan trying to do really fine work.
How so?
Well, prior to the 12th century, if an artisan in the region wanted to create luxury vessels or intricate, thin architectural tiles, they were essentially fighting against the nature of the material. Standard earth and clay is abundant, sure, but it is entirely opaque.
Depending on the iron content in the local soil.
Exactly. It usually fires to a dark brown, a reddish terracotta, or a dull buff color. And on top of that, it's heavy and brittle.
Right.
So if you try to roll it out into a very thin tile, it's highly prone to warping or cracking in the extreme heat of the kiln.
So I'm assuming this is where the material chemistry has to evolve, because if the artisans want to create finer, more detailed patterns, they need a better canvas than dark, heavy terracotta.
They desperately needed a revolution in materials, and that arrived with the introduction of stone paste, which is also commonly referred to in archaeological texts as fritware.
Fritware, okay.
Yeah, this was an entirely new recipe. It's a composite material that fundamentally changed the trajectory of Islamic ceramics. Stone paste is a mixture composed primarily of finely ground quartz, mixed with a very small amount of white clay, and a crucial third ingredient called glass frit.
Let's unpack that recipe because glass frit sounds highly specific. What exactly is a frit and why add it to crushed quartz?
Well, a frit is essentially crushed, pre-fired glass. The artisans would melt sand and plant ash together to create a crude glass, let it cool, and then just grind it down into a fine powder.
Okay, so this powder is the frit.
Right, and the reason they needed to mix this with the ground quartz comes down to thermodynamics. Quartz is incredibly hard and fires to a beautiful, stark white color. The problem is that quartz has a melting point of around 1700 degrees Celsius.
Which is far hotter than any medieval wood-fired kiln could possibly achieve, right?
Exactly. A medieval kiln might reach 1,000, maybe 1,100 degrees Celsius on a good day. So if you put a piece of pure quartz into that kiln, absolutely nothing happens. It just gets hot.
It won't fuse together to form a solid object.
No, and this is where the glass frit acts as a chemical catalyst, or more accurately, a flux. When the artisan mixes the quartz, the small amount of clay for plasticity, and the glass frit together, they form a paste. They shape this paste into a tile and place it in the kiln.
And as the temperature inside the kiln rises to that 1,000-degree mark, the glass frit begins to melt.
It melts, turning into a liquid that seeps into the microscopic spaces between the solid quartz particles.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And as the kiln cools, that liquid glass solidifies, effectively gluing all the quartz particles together into a solid, highly durable matrix.
It's essentially a medieval version of a modern synthetic composite.
Yeah.
Like you have the structural framework of the quartz held together by the binding agent of the glass.
That's a great way to think about it. And the physical properties of this new material were vastly superior to standard clay. Stone paste allowed artisans to create tiles and vessels that were much thinner, considerably stronger, and highly resistant to thermal shock. But the most vital property of stone paste was its aesthetic result. When fired, this composite material emerged from the kiln as a stark, brilliant white.
Now, why was the white color so highly prized? Could they not just paint a standard red clay tile white?
Well, they could use an opaque white glaze, and they often did, but having a solid white body allowed for much greater luminosity. The real driver behind this obsession with the white canvas was international trade.
The Silk Road.
Exactly. During this period, the Silk Road was facilitating a massive influx of highly prized Ming Dynasty porcelains imported from China.
So the Islamic courts were looking at this Chinese porcelain, noting how incredibly thin, strong, and pure white it was, and they wanted to replicate it.
They coveted it deeply. However, they lacked the specific geological materials required to make true porcelain.
Right, because Chinese porcelain relies on a very specific type of white clay called kaolin.
Yes, which is essentially free of the iron impurities that turn regular clay red. Furthermore, the Chinese artisans at places like Jingdezhen had developed massive, highly insulated dragon kilns capable of reaching the extreme temperatures needed to vitrify kaolin.
Which the artisans in the Middle East and Central Asia lacked. They didn't have the kaolin or the kilns.
Right, so stone paste was their workaround. It was an ingenious, locally developed chemical solution to mimic the visual qualities of imported luxury goods.
That makes perfect sense. So they couldn't make porcelain, so they reverse-engineered the look of porcelain using quartz and crushed glass.
Exactly. It provided that crisp, bright white canvas they desperately wanted. Once they had this brilliant white stone paste body, the artisans could apply a glaze over the top of it.
And this glaze acted as an impervious glassy layer that protected the tile from moisture and wear.
Right, while simultaneously providing a highly luminous surface. Light would travel through the transparent glaze, hit the stark white quartz body underneath, and reflect back out, making the colors painted on the tile incredibly vibrant.
So we have established how they built the perfect white canvas. The base material is finally capable of handling delicate, intricate work. But having a blank canvas is only half the battle.
Absolutely.
The artisans still had to figure out how to decorate it in a way that commanded the attention of emperors and sultans.
And the decoration of that canvas is where the true chemical mastery of the Islamic artisans becomes apparent. This brings us to the highly guarded, complex techniques of surface decoration, most notably the production of lusterware.
Right, which reached its absolute zenith in the Iranian city of Kashan. If stone paste was the canvas, lusterware was the application of pure shifting light.
It really was.
Lusterware is a specific technique that produces a metallic, iridescent sheen on the surface of the ceramic. The finish reflects light like polished metal, shifting from golden yellow to rich copper to deep ruby red, depending entirely on the angle of the ambient light.
And the technique actually originated much earlier, around the 8th century in Egypt. It was likely a response to early Islamic sumptuary laws that discouraged the use of solid gold and silver vessels for everyday use.
Oh, right. So if you cannot drink from a solid gold cup, you create a ceramic cup that looks identically like solid gold.
Exactly. From Egypt, the technique moved through Iraq and eventually found its most sophisticated expression in Kashan between the 12th and 14th centuries.
So how does an artisan actually turn a mixture of sand and glass into something that looks like solid, shimmering metal? It sounds like actual alchemy.
It does, and the process is incredibly demanding. It relies on a highly volatile double firing method. The chemistry involved leaves almost zero room for error.
Okay, take us through it.
First, the artisan takes the white stone paste tile, applies a standard transparent or opaque white glaze, and fires it in the kiln. Once it cools, you have a finished, completely sealed, glassy white tile.
So this is the first firing. The tile is technically complete as a functional object.
Right. The transformation happens in the second stage. The artisan takes a specialized mixture containing specific metallic oxides, primarily silver oxide and copper oxide.
Okay, metal powders.
Yes. These metal powders are mixed with an earthy medium, usually a red or yellow ochre, and some vinegar or grape juice to create a paintable paste. The artisan uses this paste to paint their intricate designs directly onto the cold, already fired glaze of the tile.
They paint the design and then it goes back into the kiln for the second firing. But this second firing is fundamentally different from the first, right?
It is what we call a reduction firing, and it requires the artisan to manipulate the atmosphere inside the kiln with absolute precision.
How so?
Well, in a normal firing, you want a clean, hot fire with plenty of oxygen. This is an oxidizing atmosphere. But for lusterware, the artisan deliberately chokes the kiln. They introduce damp wood, specific green shrubs, or other materials that produce heavy, thick, carbon-rich smoke.
They restrict the airflow.
Yes, creating an environment that is starved of oxygen.
What happens chemically inside that smoke-filled chamber?
The heavy carbon smoke, specifically the carbon monoxide gas, is chemically desperate for oxygen. Since there is no free oxygen in the air of the kiln, the carbon monoxide looks for oxygen elsewhere.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, it finds the oxygen atoms attached to the silver oxide and copper oxide that the artisan painted onto the tile. The carbon physically rips the oxygen atoms away from the metal oxides,
Leaving behind what?
leaving behind an impossibly thin, microscopic layer of pure elemental silver and pure copper metal. Because the kiln is just hot enough to soften the glaze but not melt it completely, these pure metal nanoparticles fuse permanently into the very top layer of the glaze.
That is redox chemistry happening in a medieval brick oven.
Exactly. When the tile cools and is removed from the kiln, it initially looks like it is covered in dull mud. But when the artisan washes away the leftover ochre paste, the metallic film is revealed. It is permanently bonded. It will not rub off.
That is just fascinating.
We actually have a remarkable primary source that details this exact procedure. Around the year 1300, a historian who was actually a member of a prominent ceramic-producing family, Abu al-Qasim Kashani, wrote a treatise detailing the operations of a ceramics workshop.
I imagine he didn't describe it in terms of nanoparticles and carbon monoxide, though.
No, he described it in the language of his era. He referred to the luster process as a kind of alchemy that made the tiles shine like the light of the sun. He detailed the specific minerals required, the exact types of wood needed for the smoke, and the incredible difficulty of getting the temperature just right.
Because if the kiln was too hot, the metals would vaporize completely, right?
Right. And if it was too cool, the metals wouldn't fuse to the glaze and would just wash off with the ochre.
Because it was so difficult, and because the results were so visually spectacular, this technique was a fiercely guarded trade secret.
Highly guarded. The families in Kashan held a near monopoly on high-end luster production. The city became so inextricably linked with this specific art form that the Persian word for glazed tile, kashi, derives directly from the name of the city.
To fully grasp the societal impact of these Kashan luster artisans, we should look closely at one specific monumental artifact. The shimmering luster mihrab from Kashan.
Yes.
This piece was completed in the year 1226 and is currently housed in the Museum for Islamic Art in Berlin.
Right.
A mihrab is the highly decorated prayer niche in the wall of a mosque that indicates the direction of Mecca.
And this particular mihrab from the Meydan Mosque in Kashan is staggering in its scale and execution. It stands nearly 3 meters tall and is composed of 74 individual tiles.
74.
Yeah, that all had to be molded, glazed, painted with metallic oxides, and reduction fired in perfectly matching batches.
I'm looking at the details of this piece. The sheer volume of text covering every available surface is striking. But it's a very specific curation of inscriptions, isn't it?
The text serves a dual purpose. It creates an intricate visual texture, but it also communicates a highly specific theological stance.
Okay, tell me more about that.
On the outer bands, you have universal Quranic verses, most notably the throne verse, which speaks to the omnipresence and infinite power of God. This is standard for a mosque. But intertwined with these universal verses on the inner bands are specific Shiite professions of faith.
Really?
Yes. The text explicitly names Ali as the chosen representative of God, reflecting the distinct Shiite religious context of Kashan during that era.
Aesthetically, the way they handled the text is brilliant. The heavy, monumental calligraphy is rendered in a deep cobalt blue that was painted under the glaze. But the entire background, the intricate swirling arabesque vines behind the text, is covered in the golden brown luster.
So when the light hits it, the dark blue text seems to physically float above a shifting pool of liquid metal.
There is a specific detail embedded in that text that speaks to the shifting social dynamics of the era. Tucked into the lower left corner of the mihrab, written in conspicuously large letters almost as prominent as the divine Quranic words themselves, is the signature of the craftsman.
Yes.
The inscription reads, "This has been written at the end of Safar in the year 1226 by Al-Hassan bin Arab Shah." Wait, for an artisan to place his name so boldly right next to the sacred words of the Quran on the most important architectural element of a mosque, it feels incredibly brazen. How did a manual laborer get away with such a display of ego?
Well, we have to contextualize this within the broader landscape of the 14th century economy. Craftsmen who possessed these alchemical secrets, who understood the complex metallurgical formulas and the precise control of reduction kilns, were no longer viewed as mere manual laborers.
Right, they were beginning to assert their agency.
They recognized that they held a monopoly on a highly valuable technology.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
local elites, the sultans, and the wealthy merchants were all competing for these shimmering tiles to adorn their palaces and religious foundations.
The artisans understood the immense value of their specialized knowledge. Placing a signature so boldly was a mechanism for securing recognition, elevating their social status, and ultimately ensuring they could command top prices for their highly sought-after labor.
It was a brand name.
It was a guarantee of quality. It was a way of saying, I am the master who possesses the knowledge to manifest this divine beauty. And the enduring value of that specific brand is highlighted by the journey of this mihrab in the modern era.
Right. The piece remained installed in the Meydan Mosque for over 6 centuries. But by the late 19th century, the mosque had fallen into disrepair. The mihrab was removed, piece by piece, and acquired by a British consul named John Richard Preece.
And Preece took the 74 tiles back to London. It was exhibited in 1913, and it immediately captivated European art collectors. The German art historian Friedrich Saar, who was instrumental in building the Islamic art collection in Berlin, became obsessed with acquiring it.
And in 1927, Saar finally purchased the mihrab for the museum,
The price tag was £7,000.
which was a staggering sum for an architectural fragment at the time.
To afford it, the museum had to take out a massive commercial bank loan. And to pay off the loan, they actually had to deaccession and sell a highly valuable 16th century Isfahan carpet from their own collection.
That is the level of sacrifice a major European institution was willing to make to acquire a prime example of Kashan lusterware.
It really was.
Now, the lusterware technique solved a very specific aesthetic problem: how to create a surface finish that looked like solid gold. But these artisans faced an entirely different, highly physical problem when they tried to move beyond monochromatic finishes and create complex multicolored designs on a single tile.
Yeah, the ambition to create polychrome tiles. Tiles with distinct, sharp areas of lapis blue, vibrant turquoise, deep red, and pure white ran immediately into the realities of high-temperature physics.
Because glaze is essentially liquid glass.
Exactly. When you place a tile coated in various colored glazes into a kiln and the temperature rises to 1,000 degrees Celsius, those glazes melt. They become fluid.
So if you have painted a wet blue glaze directly adjacent to a wet yellow glaze,
The moment they melt, they're going to bleed, mix, and muddy together. Instead of sharp, crisp geometric lines, you end up with a blurry, indistinct puddle of colors.
you cannot just ask liquid glass to stay perfectly still. You have to physically force it to stay in place,
And the most elegant solution to this physical problem was a technique known as cuerda seca.
which translates from Spanish to dry cord.
Right. It was a highly practical chemical innovation. The artisans developed a specific resist paste. They would take beeswax or sometimes a heavy viscous vegetable fat and mix it heavily with manganese oxide.
Manganese oxide is a dark metallic mineral powder.
Yes. They would take this waxy dark paste and use a fine brush to draw the precise, complex contours of their design directly onto the unglazed stone paste tile. They were essentially drawing an outline.
So they have drawn the outline in wax. What happens next?
Inside the borders of these waxy outlines, they carefully applied the different liquid-colored glazes. The wax acts as a physical barrier. Because wax repels water, the water-based glazes beat up and refuse to cross the line.
It's the exact same principle as a child, pressing hard with a wax crayon on a piece of paper and then painting over the whole page with watercolors. The wax resists the water, keeping the paint contained within the lines.
The mechanics are identical, but the cuerda seca technique had to survive the kiln.
Right.
When the tile was placed into the fire and the temperature began to rise, a specific sequence of events occurred. At relatively low temperatures, the beeswax or the vegetable fat simply burn away, turning into smoke.
But if the wax burns away, what stops the glazes from running together when they finally melt?
Because the wax was mixed with manganese oxide, the wax burns off, but the manganese oxide does not. It is left behind on the surface of the tile as a dark, raised, unglazed line.
Oh, I see.
This raised line acts as a physical dam. It literally holds back the melting, flowing colored glazes, keeping the liquid blue safely separated from the liquid yellow.
It functions exactly like the lead framework in a stained glass window. The lead physically separates the distinct pieces of colored glass. Here, the manganese oxide line is the framework holding the colored glazes apart.
It allowed for incredibly sharp, crisp polychrome designs on a single, flat surface. And cuerda seca was just one of the methods they developed to control color. There was also the Minai technique, which approached the problem differently.
How so?
Instead of trying to fire all the colors at once, the Minai artisans would fire the tile with a stable base glaze first. Then they would paint delicate enamel colors over the fired glaze.
But if they put it back in the kiln to set the enamels, wouldn't the base glaze melt again?
That is the genius of Minai. They formulated the overglaze enamels to melt at significantly lower temperatures than the base glaze.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, they would fire the tile multiple times, starting with the colors that required the highest heat, and working their way down to the most delicate pigments, dropping the kiln temperature with each successive firing.
It sounds incredibly labor-intensive.
It was, and it carried a high risk of the tile shattering from repeated thermal shock.
But the absolute pinnacle of this polychrome mastery, the era that truly scaled up the concept of the multicolored tile, was the Safavid dynasty, ruling over Persia from 1501 to 1736.
The Safavids took these concepts and developed the haft-rang, or seven-color technique. Under ambitious rulers like Shah Abbas I, they were no longer just decorating small prayer niches or single vessels. They were tasked with covering entire imperial cities.
Shah Abbas moved his capital to Isfahan and initiated a massive building program. He wanted monumental mosques, vast public squares, and sprawling palaces, and he wanted them completely covered in vibrant color.
And the haft-rang technique was optimized for scale. The artisans used standard, large, square tiles. They would paint the entire complex design across a grid of these tiles, using the waxy resist lines to separate a brilliant palette of turquoise, deep lapis blue, bright yellow, crisp black, stark white, vibrant red, and rich green.
Because they were using standardized square tiles, they could manufacture them by the thousands in massive workshops, fire them quickly, and assemble them on the walls of Isfahan with incredible speed compared to older methods.
It was an assembly line approach to monumental beauty. The walls of the Shah Mosque in Isfahan are entirely enveloped in these haft-rang tiles, creating a shifting, shimmering tapestry of color that covers the domes, the minarets, and the massive entrance portals.
Now, while the Safavids were mastering the painted, multicolored square tile, there was another tradition developing parallel to this, an approach that completely rejected the brush, rejected the painted line, and rejected the idea of putting multiple colors on a single tile.
Right. We're moving from the chemistry of the glaze directly into the mathematics of the mosaic. We have to examine the techniques of zellij in the West, Morocco in the East, and the profound geometric discoveries that emerged from this physical labor.
The mosaic technique is fundamentally different from quarta seca, or half-frame. Instead of painting a design, the artisans cut solid colored tiles into tiny, mathematically perfect geometric shapes, and then fitted those shapes together like a massive, complex jigsaw puzzle.
And this approach evolved distinctly in different regions. In the Western Islamic world, specifically the Maghreb in North Africa and Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula, this cut-tile mosaic technique flourished under the name zellij, or as it was referred to in Spain, alicatado.
We see this reaching its absolute peak in the 14th century, under the patronage of the Marinid, Nasrid, and Zayinid dynasties.
The Alhambra in Granada is the ultimate expression of this Western zellij tradition.
Meanwhile, in the Eastern Islamic world, a highly related but stylistically distinct cut-tile mosaic technique was known as Morocco. The mature, spectacular examples of Morocco were perfected in Timurid Samarkand during the 15th century and were later integrated into the Safavid architecture of Isfahan.
Yes.
Let's break down the physical labor of the zellij process, because the sheer physical effort required is difficult to comprehend. How does an artisan actually create one of these massive geometric panels?
The process begins with raw materials. The artisans fire hundreds of solid, single-colored glazed tiles. You have a stack of pure blue tiles, a stack of pure green, pure black, and pure white.
Okay.
The artisan, known as a malam, does not paint anything. Instead, they take a fired glazed tile and hold it against an iron anvil.
But a fired ceramic tile is basically a piece of thick glass attached to brittle stone. It shatters easily.
Exactly. So they use a highly specialized tool called a menkach. It is a heavy, short-handled iron hammer with a very sharp, chisel-like blade on one end. The artisan uses the menkach to strike the glazed surface of the tile with incredibly precise, controlled force, chipping away the excess material to form a tiny, specific geometric shape. An 8-pointed star, a hexagonal lozenge, a thin rectangular band.
So they are hand-chiseling brittle ceramic into perfect geometry. But they don't just cut the shape out vertically, do they?
No, this is where the engineering of the mosaic becomes crucial. As they cut the shape, they simultaneously bevel the edges. They chip away the unglazed porous clay on the back of the tile piece at a sharp angle.
Why angle the back?
So that the glazed top surface is physically wider than the clay base. It creates a wedge shape. When you place two of these beveled pieces next to each other on a flat surface, the glazed top edges meet perfectly tight, practically seamless.
Okay, I see.
But underneath, the beveled angles leave a hollow, V-shaped gap between the bases of the tiles.
And that gap is functional.
Absolutely. The artisans assemble the entire complex pattern face down on a flat floor. Once the thousands of tiny pieces are arranged, they pour liquid plaster over the entire back of the mosaic.
Which flows down into those V-shaped gaps.
Right. And when the plaster hardens, it grips every single individual tile piece with a firm dovetail joint, locking them into a single, rigid panel that can then be hoisted up and attached to the wall.
To help you visualize the scale of patience required for this labor, consider a specific room in the Alhambra called the Mirador de Lindaraja. In this room, there are mosaic panels where these tiny hand-cut pieces of tile are used not just for geometric stars, but to form fine, flowing Arabic Nasqi calligraphy.
They're spelling out long, poetic inscriptions using tiny shards of colored glaze.
Some of the individual tile pieces making up the curves of these letters measure just 2 millimeters wide.
2 millimeters.
I want you to conceptualize striking a piece of glass with a heavy iron hammer to carve out a perfect 2-millimeter sliver, repeatedly, thousands of times, to spell out poetry on a wall.
The labor is monumental, almost meditative in its repetition. But the physical labor is entirely subservient to the underlying philosophy of the art form.
The primary use of these tiny pieces was to construct highly complex tessellations.
Right.
A tessellation is a mathematical method of covering a flat surface with a pattern of geometric shapes in such a way that there are absolutely no overlaps between the shapes and no empty gaps left behind. Every piece fits perfectly into the next.
And in the context of Islamic art, this strict reliance on geometry was not mere decoration. It was a visual manifestation of theology.
How so?
The use of regular polygons to create infinitely repeating geometric motifs, such as the intricate 6, 8, 12, and 16-pointed stars, reflected the underlying invisible order of the natural world.
It's the idea that the universe is not chaotic, but governed by strict, rational, divine laws.
More importantly, a pattern that radiates outward from a single central point and expands infinitely in all directions was seen as a direct visual representation of the indivisible unity and the infinite, boundless nature of God. The geometry is a mechanism for spiritual contemplation.
It is mathematics operating as a form of visual prayer. But the mathematics did not remain static. The artisans were constantly pushing the boundaries of what could be drafted. And around the year 1200, a major procedural breakthrough occurred regarding what are known as girih patterns.
Right. Prior to the 13th century, if an artisan wanted to design one of these complex interlocking strapwork patterns on a wall, they had to draft it using traditional geometric tools.
Like a straight edge and a compass.
Yes. Drawing large intersecting circles and plotting out complex zigzagging grids directly onto the surface before they could even begin cutting tiles. It was prone to compounding errors. A millimeter off on one side of the wall ruined the pattern on the other side.
So what was the breakthrough?
The invention of a modular system. The artisans conceptualized a set of 5 specific equilateral polygons. These are the girih tiles.
Okay, what are the shapes?
The set consists of a regular decagon, a 10-sided shape, an irregular pentagon, a hexagon, a bow tie shape, and a rhombus. Crucially, all 5 of these shapes share the exact same edge length.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the true genius of the girih system lies in the decoration on the tiles themselves. The artisans drew decorative lines across the surface of these 5 tiles. These lines specifically intersect the midpoints of every edge at exact angles.
What does that mean in practice?
It means that if you take any 2 of those 5 shapes and place them edge to edge, the decorative lines drawn on their surfaces will match up perfectly every single time.
That is brilliant.
It takes the incredibly difficult task of drafting a complex, interlocking pattern with a compass and turns it into a simple, modular assembly puzzle. The artisan simply lays the 5 shapes out on a grid, and the complex, beautiful strapwork pattern emerges automatically from the connecting lines.
Because it became a modular system, the complexity of the patterns could scale up dramatically. They no longer had to draft the entire wall at once. They just had to arrange the 5 tiles.
Right. And by playing with these 5 shapes over centuries, the medieval artisans stumbled into something mathematically profound.
By the 15th century, they were using the girih system to construct patterns that were mathematically quasi-crystalline.
They discovered Penrose patterns.
Let's explain what a Penrose pattern actually is. Because if you look at a standard tile floor, say a checkerboard of black and white squares, it has what mathematicians call translational symmetry. You can take a section of the checkerboard, pick it up, slide it 2 feet to the left, set it down, and it will match up perfectly with the rest of the floor. It repeats exactly.
A Penrose pattern, formally described by Roger Penrose in the 1970s, completely fills a 2-dimensional plane without leaving gaps, but it lacks that translational symmetry.
It never repeats itself exactly.
No, you can never take a large section of the pattern, slide it over, and have it match up perfectly. It contains hidden, highly complex symmetries, often based on the golden ratio and exhibiting 5-fold or 10-fold rotational symmetry, but it is infinite and non-repeating.
It's a pattern that demonstrates extreme, highly regulated order, but simultaneously refuses to ever fall into a simple, predictable loop.
And these medieval tile workers, operating in places like the Darby Imam Shrine in Isfahan in 1453, were constructing these exact, infinite, non-repeating Penrose patterns on the walls of shrines and mosques.
That is just incredible.
They were exploring theoretical quantum geometry through the physical manipulation of clay tiles.
They outpaced the formal written language of Western mathematics by 500 years, simply by trusting their tools and their intuition for spatial scaling.
We see the intense discipline required for this geometry heavily represented in the famous motifs of the Alhambra as well. You have specific tessellations like the Nasrid bird, which is a complex 3-pointed star with gently curved arms that interlocks flawlessly with its neighbors.
Right, and you have the interlocking pattern known as the 4 hammers, and the angular straight-line tessellation referred to as the bone pattern. Now, these strict geometric rules, the total reliance on abstract tessellations and flowing calligraphy, didn't emerge in a vacuum. The obsession with geometry was largely driven by a strict theological directive. Which brings us to the rules of aniconism and the fascinating spaces where those rules were completely ignored.
Islamic religious architecture, the mosques, the madrasas, the shrines, heavily prioritized aniconism. Aniconism is the deliberate avoidance of depicting any sentient living beings. You won't find depictions of humans, animals, or insects within the sacred spaces.
The theological reasoning behind this is quite clear and deeply rooted in the earliest days of the faith, isn't it?
The primary concern is the absolute prevention of idolatry. The core tenet of Islam is the oneness of God, Tawhid. Worship must be directed solely toward the unseen, infinite, omnipotent creator, and never toward a graven image or a physical representation.
There's also a deeper theological argument regarding the act of creation itself.
Yes, the concept that the act of creating life, of breathing a soul into a physical form, belongs exclusively to God. Therefore, a human artist who attempts to paint or sculpt a realistic depiction of a living creature is seen as arrogant, attempting to usurp a divine prerogative.
The artist is creating an empty shell that they cannot truly bring to life.
Exactly.
So if you cannot paint saints, historical narrative scenes, or the faces of prophets on the walls of a mosque, how do you decorate the space? You turn to the abstract expressions we have been discussing.
Right, you utilize calligraphy to communicate the literal word of God. You utilize the infinite geometries to symbolize the divine order, and you utilize the floral arabesque.
The arabesque is a flowing, unending, interlacing vine of foliage. Artisans often utilize highly stylized lotus flowers and bursting pomegranate motifs within these vines.
These were not meant to be realistic botanical illustrations. They were symbolic, evocative representations of the lush, eternal gardens of paradise described in the Quran.
The endless repetition of the geometric knot, or the flowing vine that has no clear beginning and no clear end, serves a meditative function. It is designed to visually remind the believer standing in the courtyard of the transient, temporary nature of the physical world,
contrasting it with the eternal, infinite nature of the divine realm.
But that is the strict rule within the sacred realm. However, there's a very common misconception that Islamic art, as a monolith, is entirely devoid of figures across all mediums. That is simply not true.
Not true at all. While the sacred spaces strictly adhere to aniconism, the secular spaces, the private royal palaces, the public bathhouses, the everyday luxury objects used by the elites, did not feel constrained by this rule.
The secular realm was incredibly vibrant and freely depicted humans, animals, and mythical beasts.
We can examine a spectacular example of this secular flexibility at the Anatolian Seljuk Kubadabad Palace, located on the shores of Lake Basihir, which was constructed around the year 1272. When modern archaeologists excavated the ruins of this summer palace, they didn't find austere, abstract geometry.
They found a massive array of vibrant, underglazed painted tiles.
The tiles were shaped primarily like 8-pointed stars, designed to interlock with cross-shaped cruciform tiles, and painted highly delicately upon the surfaces of these stars, using vibrant turquoises, rich greens, deep purples, and bright blues, were highly detailed, vivid figures.
The archaeologists found delicate paintings of humans, double-headed eagles, peacocks, falcons, hares, and bears. Imagine stepping into a royal palace in the 13th century and seeing a tiled wall depicting a lifelike brown bear lumbering across an 8-pointed star.
It shatters the preconceived notion of austere Islamic art.
It perfectly illustrates the divide. The Kubadabad Palace was not a place of solemn prayer. It was a place of earthly power, a staging ground for royal hunting expeditions, a venue for courtly feasts and entertainment.
And the tile work directly reflected the reality of the space. It depicted the animals the Sultan hunted and the courtiers who surrounded him.
This secular flexibility also made the courts incredibly receptive to foreign artistic influences. They were not insular, they were looking outward.
Very much so. During the Ilkhanid era, which followed the devastating Mongol conquests of the 13th century, the political unification of vast territories under the Mongols opened up the Silk Road to an unprecedented degree.
This led to a massive influx of Chinese goods, Chinese textiles, and Chinese aesthetics pouring into the Persian courts. We refer to this integration of Chinese motifs as chinoiserie.
The artisans in the Islamic world eagerly absorbed these new visual vocabularies. Suddenly, alongside the traditional Persian arabesques, you see dragons with serpentine bodies and flaming pearls and intricate phoenixes with sweeping tail feathers.
These potent symbols of Chinese imperial power were integrated directly into the Persian tilework used to decorate secular palaces.
The strict geometry of the mosque gave way to the mythical beasts of the East in the context of the secular palace. This fluidity, this constant willingness to adopt, adapt, and synthesize foreign elements is central to understanding how these distinct regional styles managed to spread and cross-pollinate.
Right, because how exactly did Chinese color palettes, Persian glazing chemistry and North African geometric theories managed to influence one another so thoroughly across thousands of miles of rugged terrain? The answer is human movement.
The entire evolution of Islamic tilework was directly driven by the movement of skilled craftsmen across vast empires. This was the engine of empire at work. Sometimes these master artisans moved voluntarily. A renowned lusterware potter from Kashan might travel to a newly established court in Anatolia because the local sultan was offering highly lucrative commissions and lavish patronage.
But very often, this mobility was not voluntary. Artisans were treated as highly valuable strategic resources. When an empire conquered a city, they didn't just loot the gold, they looted the human capital.
Artisans were taken by force, uprooted from their workshops, and marched across continents as spoils of war.
That's a stark reality.
The synthesis of these artistic styles serves as a physical map of conflict, conquest, and displacement. When we look at the breathtaking Safavid art of the 16th century in Iran, we are actually looking at a synthesis forced by conflict.
Right? The Safavids absorbed the refined, highly intellectual, mathematically precise architectural aesthetics of the Timurid Empire to their east, and merged it with the bold, dynamic, brightly colored energy of the Turkoman polities to their west.
We have a perfect historical vignette that vividly illustrates the trauma and the resulting artistic synthesis of this forced mobility. We can trace the journey of a highly skilled Ottoman craftsman known as Nakash Ali.
Yes, in the year 1402, the rising Ottoman Empire suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Ankara. They were crushed by the armies of the Central Asian conqueror Timur.
Following the battle, Timur rounded up the most skilled artisans, intellectuals, and craftsmen he could find in the Ottoman ranks. Nakash Ali was captured and forcibly marched by Timur's army all the way back to Timur's capital city of Samarkand, deep in the heart of Central Asia.
For Nakash Ali, a craftsman accustomed to the early Ottoman styles of Western Anatolia, arriving in Samarkand must have been a massive sensory shock. Samarkand at that time was the focal point of the Timurid Renaissance. Nakash Ali was exposed to the absolute pinnacle of Timurid architectural style.
He saw massive, soaring, ribbed domes covered entirely in deep cobalt blue tiles. He witnessed the incredibly intricate, microscopic precision of the mosaic cut tile mosaics that decorated the monumental tombs of the Timurid elite.
He lived there as a captive, but he's a craftsman. He absorbed these techniques, studied the geometry, and learned the chemical recipes for the brilliant Timurid blues.
Eventually, the political situation shifted, and Nakash Ali was permitted to return home to the Ottoman city of Bursa.
When he returned, he didn't just bring back tales of Central Asia. He brought the Timurid aesthetic with him in his hands. In the year 1424, Nakash Ali was appointed as the chief designer responsible for completing the stunning interior tile decoration of the Ottoman Green Mosque in Bursa.
But the records indicate he didn't execute this massive project alone. The inscriptions within the mosque explicitly state that he worked alongside a specialized group of craftsmen designated as the Masters of Tabriz.
Tabriz, located in modern-day northwestern Iran, was a major historical center of Persian ceramic art. So if you stand inside the Ottoman Green Mosque, you are witnessing an incredible convergence.
You have a local Ottoman craftsman, profoundly trained by his captivity in Timurid Samarkand, working side by side with Iranian masters from Tabriz.
Together, they produced massive, complex cuerda seca tiles that seamlessly synthesized Ottoman structural forms, Timurid color palettes, and Iranian glazing techniques.
It is a physical record of human connection forged through the crucible of war. And it was exactly this kind of intense cross-pollination that provided the foundation for the Ottomans to eventually establish their own legendary state-sponsored tile center in the city of Iznik.
The Iznik workshops, which reached their zenith in the 16th century, are a fascinating study in state-sponsored industrial design. The Ottoman court in Istanbul centralized production. They established a highly systematic, rigid guild approach to tile-making to supply the massive imperial building projects of sultans like Suleiman the Magnificent.
Earlier, we discussed how the Islamic courts were obsessed with Chinese Ming porcelain but lacked the kaolin clay to make it. The Iznik potters essentially solved this problem through brute force chemical engineering.
How exactly do they do that?
Well, the Iznik potters reverse engineered the visual impact of Ming porcelain. They refined their stone paste recipes, sourcing incredibly pure, bright white quartz deposits. They developed a body that was astonishingly white and hard. They then specialized in painting vivid, highly detailed designs using imported cobalt blue, mimicking the Chinese blue and white wares perfectly.
But they didn't stop at blue and white. They eventually expanded their palette, developing brilliant, raised tomato reds known as Armenian bowl and deep, vivid emerald greens, creating the definitive Ottoman aesthetic.
And the Iznik artisans also became deeply renowned for their mastery of integrating calligraphy directly into the tile panel, specifically utilizing the Thuluth script.
Thuluth is characterized by tall, sweeping, highly graceful vertical lines that command attention from a distance. These Iznik tiles became the visual signature of the Ottoman Empire, covering the intimate chambers of the Topkapi Palace and the massive soaring walls of the great mosques of Istanbul, designed by the architect Sinan.
The influence of the Persian artisans didn't just travel westward to fuel the Ottoman workshops, though. The mobility of craftsmen also carried these techniques far to the east, dramatically influencing the architecture of the Indian subcontinent.
When the Mughal Empire, which had ancestral roots in Central Asia, established its immense dominance over South Asia, they heavily imported Persian architectural vocabulary. They brought in Persian architects and craftsmen who were masters of Kashani aesthetics.
Kashani being the broader, generalized term used for these intricate Persian mosaic and painted tiles, tracing its linguistic roots back to the city of Kashan.
The Mughals took the rigorous precision of the Persian Morak cut tile mosaic and adapted it to a new environment. You can see this breathtaking, highly successful synthesis in structures like the Wazir Khan Mosque in the city of Lahore, built between 1634 and 1635.
If you walk through the bustling streets of Lahore and enter the courtyard of the Wazir Khan Mosque, the sensory shift is immediate. The walls are completely enveloped in highly complex tilework, but the color palette is fundamentally different from a mosque in Isfahan or Samarkand.
It is a masterclass in regional adaptation. The Wazir Khan Mosque utilizes the exact mechanical precision of the Persian cut tile mosaic. The tiles are beveled and fit together seamlessly.
But the Mughal artisans blended that Persian technique with indigenous South Asian colors. They incorporated incredibly vibrant mustard yellows, warm, deep oranges, and lush greens that reflect the local landscape.
They also integrated local botanical motifs. Alongside the traditional abstract geometric stars, you find tiles cut into the shapes of tall cypress trees, flowering irises, and complex floral bouquets, all rendered in those vivid South Asian colors.
It is the strict mechanics of Persian technique filtered entirely through the vibrant, humid lens of the Indian subcontinent.
So when we ask what all of this means, the answer lies in the tiles themselves. These small pieces of fired clay are acting as indestructible historical passports.
A single tiled wall in a Turkish mosque or a Pakistani shrine might display a color palette that originated in Yuan dynasty China, a glazing chemistry formulated by a family in the Persian city of Kashan, and a geometric framework developed by mathematicians in North Africa, all executed by a craftsman who learned his trade as a prisoner of war in Central Asia.
It is a physical, enduring record of human connection, trade, conflict, and intellectual exchange. The history of the Islamic tile is a journey of immense scale and ingenuity. It begins in the desert, with nomadic traditions where tribes decorated the interiors of their temporary tents with brightly patterned, woven fabrics.
When those nomadic peoples eventually settled, conquered, and built monumental empires, they sought to make the temporary permanent. They sought to translate the vibrancy, the warmth, and the complexity of those woven fabrics into solid, unyielding stone and clay.
They took the raw dirt of the earth, and they systematically solved puzzle after puzzle. They solved the thermodynamic puzzle of melting quartz by inventing the glass frit of stone paste.
They solved the chemical puzzles of running, bleeding glazes by inventing the waxy manganese dams of cuerda seca.
They solved the metallurgical puzzles of turning dull, earthy oxides into the shimmering, shifting gold of lusterware by mastering the invisible chemistry of smoke-filled, reduced oxygen kilns.
And they solved the spatial puzzles of the universe through sheer, staggering physical labor. They hand-chiseled millions of fragile, glassy fragments, beveling the edges perfectly to build mathematically flawless tessellations that span from the sun-drenched courtyards of the Alhambra in Spain to the monumental, bustling mosques of Lahore.
Which leaves us with a final concept to mull over, circling back to the beginning of our deep dive, back to those girih tiles and the quasi-crystalline penrose patterns. We know for a fact that in the 15th century, these artisans were routinely creating massive, complex wall panels featuring infinite, non-repeating symmetry.
The ultimate question is this. Did these medieval craftsmen intellectually mathematically comprehend the highly advanced theorems underlying quasi-crystals?
Did they understand the invisible math? Or, by inventing the physical tools, the 5 perfectly proportioned shapes of the girih tiles, did the physical properties of the materials themselves simply guide their hands to a profound mathematical truth 5 centuries before it was formally articulated on paper?
It suggests that true, deep craftsmanship, the physical act of working intimately with materials day after day, is a rigorous form of scientific discovery in itself.
The hands of the artisan recognized the fundamental truth of the universe long before the formal equations were ever written down. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.